everybody. My name is Nasser Abrahmi. I'm a faculty fellow at the Kevorkian Center. I want to just start by welcoming everybody to this, our second event in our Global Uprising series. We're very grateful to have you all with us. I want to say a very brief word about the series and about the event, and then a briefer word about format, and then I'll introduce our speakers and we can get right into it. So Global Uprising is a series of workshops that's going to span this year, this semester, and the next, that really revolves around one basic central question, which is, how do we rethink collective action from our present, right? And we've assumed as a kind of working premise for this series that the present is no longer something in which uprising happens, but the present, in a certain sense, the time itself is uprising, right? It's defined by global insurgency, if you will. And so we're taking the ongoing anti-racist uprisings here, and we're taking the sort of 10-year anniversary of the Arab revolts, themselves very clearly also ongoing, as a kind of launching point into a form of inquiry that poses how we think, how we conceptualize this kind of resonant chain of disobedience and refusal and flight. And the event today, titled The Protracted Present of Uprising, is perhaps the event that speaks most directly to the kind of core concerns of the series, or it speaks at least to this kind of temporal framing of the series. And so we've asked our participants to consider a broad set of questions, a broad set of prompts, in part around how and whether we should think of these uprisings in temporal terms, whether we should historicize them and periodize them, what gets left out if we do that, what are the risks of that, and how we think about sort of the changing modalities, the changing formations of uprising across this decade, and this kind of last 10 years. And what kind of concepts we need, right? What kind of concepts we need to think through to unpack this decade, to think through the present. What is left of the concept of revolution, for example, in its various sort of dilemmas vis-a-vis revolt or vis-a-vis reform. So we're very excited to hear from them and what they're going to tell us. Before I get to format, I just want to mention that, again, this is part of a longer series. The conversation is meant to be cumulative and ongoing. So I invite people to stick with us, to come to the next one. And I just want to highlight that there is another series happening at the Kevorkian Center called Digital Forays. That's really about what it means to think, what it means to work, what it means to be in our digital present. And actually our next event on October 29th at 12:30 Eastern Standard Time is going to be a joint workshop. It's a joint session. It's both Digital Forays and Global Uprising. And it's going to be called The Aesthetics of Digital Dissent. I want to also take this opportunity to thank our co-sponsors at the Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies. We're very grateful for their support. And in terms of format, we will proceed as follows. Each of our participants, our panelists, will have 10 minutes. After each of them speaks for 10 minutes, we will have a sort of 30-minute conversation sort of mediated by our discussant, between the participants and the discussant. And then we will break for about 30 minutes of Q&A that I encourage and invite everyone to get involved in. And there are a number of ways you can ask questions during the Q&A. You can use the raise hand function in Zoom, and one of us will call on you. Or you can use the chat box. You can either do that publicly to everyone and just pose questions, or you can DM any one of the co-hosts, and we'll try to get to as many of those questions as we can. Again, once the Q&A is over, the kind of formal part of the event will be over. We may have breakout rooms depending on what the situation is. And again, I'd encourage everyone to stick around for that conversation. Today we have with us a really exceptional set of four thinkers and activists and people whose work I have taken so much from across the years. So it's a real privilege to have them with us. I am immensely grateful that they've all agreed to come and be with us tonight. And I'm just gonna introduce them in alphabetical order and in the order of their appearance, and then I'll turn it over. So very brief introductions. Banu Bargu is an associate professor of history of consciousness at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and she is currently a member of the Institute of Advanced Study. And she is, of course, the author of Starve and Immolate, The Politics of Human Weapons. Ghassan Hage is a professor of anthropology at the University of Melbourne, and his most recent book, of course, is Racism and Environmental Threats. Alberto Toscano is a reader in critical theory and co-director for the Center for Philosophy and Critical Thought at Goldsmiths at the University of London, and he is the author of Fanaticism on the Uses of an Idea. And our discussant tonight, our very own Lisa Duggan, who is a journalist, an activist, and a professor of social and cultural analysis here at NYU. And her most recent book is Mean Girl, Ayn Rand and Neoliberal Greed. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to hand it over to Banu Bargu, and we can take it from there. So Banu, the floor is yours.
Can you hear me? Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this invitation. I am really honored to be at the virtual table with interlocutors from whom I've learned so much in the past and continue to do so. So I'm really excited about this conversation. And this is a very timely invitation for me because it offers me an opportunity to articulate some of the ideas that I'm working on right now for my new book project, and maybe even selfishly to test them out a little bit. And Nasser, I want to thank you in particular for urging me to think about the present around the questions that you sent as prompt for us. And for the audience, I don't know if they know these questions or not, but the starting prompt was, what are the political concepts we need to make sense of the last 10 years of uprising? And the question offered us a dizzying range of alternatives, each of which has been used for the present: revolution, reform, insurrection, revolt, rebellion, riot, etc. But which is more accurate? Which is more useful, more generative? And Nasser also urged us to think about the temporality of these uprisings and their global scales. So I will take my liberties with these questions. I won't be able to even pretend to offer answers to all. But I want to approach our present conjuncture, which our event names as the protracted present of uprising, and I really love that name, by way of protest actions that take the form of self-harm or self-destruction, such as hunger strikes, whether for a definite duration or indefinite, lip-sewing actions, self-immolations, etc. In other words, I want to think about the kinds of actions that forefront the body, both as a subject and as an object of violence, or borrowing from Lukács and taking liberties with that, as a subject-object of violence. So my focus will be to highlight, in a sense, the centrality of body as a materialist analytic for the present political conjuncture. And in thinking about the temporality of protests, since we were asked roughly to consider the past decade, I find it very apt to start by marking that we're almost at the 10th anniversary of Bouazizi self-immolation. And Bouazizi, we remember, set himself ablaze in front of a government building in the city of Sidi Bouzid on December 17th, 2010, after an encounter with local officials in which his fruit cart, along with the fruit and the electronic scale, which was worth quite a significant amount of his income, were confiscated, and he was also allegedly slapped and beaten by the officials, which added insult to injury. So he remained hospitalized for severe burns for the last 2 weeks of his life. The act had already instigated and inspired a local uprising whose consequences are familiar to all of us. What is maybe less known is that many more such acts have happened have taken place since that act of self-immolation. And of course, it wasn't the first of its kind, but they've taken place in Egypt and Morocco and Algeria, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, among other places. And though, of course, they haven't necessarily led to the kinds of social mobilization that their Tunisian counterpart has led to. So, but this is not all. This decade has also seen significant hunger strikes on a mass scale, and I'm thinking here of California prisons, where almost 30,000 participants were involved against arbitrary and indefinite solitary confinement. There were solidarity hunger strikes, the strikes ongoing in California prisons from Palestine. Some 3,000 of Kurdish political prisoners protested in Turkey's prisons. There were solidarity hunger strikes from around the world for protests taking place in immigration detention centers. And turning to that, in 2016, it's worth mentioning the hunger strike in Calais, organized by the asylum seekers there, which was combined with lip sewing protests. Again, not the first of its kind. I think many more had already taken place in Australian detention centers, both especially offshore in Papua New Guinea and on Mount Manus Island, but also on the Greek-Macedonian border, on the border of Italy, in many places around the world. A hunger strike plus lip sewing. And then yet another form of protest, what I call voluntary human shielding. In 2016, at least 2,000 US military veterans went to Standing Rock to participate in the struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline that cuts across 4 states and is intended to transport crude oil from North Dakota's oil fields to the refinery markets in Illinois. So Standing Rock protesters have defined the veterans' mission as serving as a kind of human shield between the protesters, the peaceful demonstrators, and the police. And just very recently in Portland, Oregon, we've witnessed hundreds of mothers who wore yellow shirts and bike helmets as they put themselves in between the police and Black Lives Matter protesters, calling themselves the Wall of Moms. So the examples can be proliferated. I just wanted to give you a sample here. And now let me turn to try to comment on how we may perhaps interpret these actions and their role in the present political conjuncture. First, I want to say, of course, that these forms of action are as much part of the political landscape of uprising in the present as are riots, spontaneous mass uprisings, and more conventional forms of protest, such as labor strikes. So they are not aberrations or exceptions in a conjuncture otherwise marked by riots, but rather really a constitutive part of it. But they're often in the margins, and they're in the margins of the news, they're in the margins of the political sphere, in prisons, in detention centers, border zones. They arise from those points in social formations where asymmetries of power are felt very acutely, injustices are experienced heavily, and opportunities for redress are often largely lacking or ineffective, even if present. But the point is they're also often rendered invisible by the lack of media coverage, and because they present difficult scenes visually, viscerally, rationally to cope with. But that they are less visible should not lead us to discount them, that they're unconventional, often not fitting our imaginaries about empowerment and transformative radical politics should not lead us to ignore them. So my second point, to try to be more specific about what kind of role they're playing, I want to propose that we approach them as symptoms of the contradictions of the present. What do I mean by that? Structurally, global capitalism, but global capitalism as an uneven formation, North and South, the South within the North as well as the North within the South. how this structural unevenness translates to different spheres, the economic sphere, deepening inequalities, mass unemployment, exploitation, but also having the privilege to be exploited, or maybe not. The political sphere, kind of deep lack of accountability, the disconnect between political establishments and the masses, the collapse, evacuation, or weakening of traditional modes of representational politics. In the social sphere, how differences are politicized and polarized, creating global regimes of racialization and alterization, and then managed by arbitrary applications of physical violence, militarized policing, mass incarceration, coupled with differential levels of structural violence, such as disinvestment in infrastructures, ecological degradation, dispossession. So this uneven conjuncture is also unevenly experienced, so multiplying the effects of unevenness based on subject positions understood intersectionally as exposing different kinds of subjects to different levels and forms of violence. So we know that social violence is inscribed on the body in the form of compromised immunities, pre-existing conditions, malnutrition, the production of very different and unlivable lives. So when we take the body as the object on which these uneven effects of the big structures are manifest and lived, experienced differently, we then see that the body is not a passive conduit, simply a relay of power, just a node in the submission of subjects. It is a war zone. It reacts. Structural violence and uneven effects are experienced as rage, as hunger, as despair, humiliation, repugnance. And in response, we have a kind of what I call the somatization of structural violence by agents when they make visible this structural violence by repeating it, by turning it on themselves in order to make it visible. What do? They starve themselves, they immolate themselves, they saw their lips, they cut themselves open. And by doing so, they present a critique of a disembodied conception of politics in which we're all considered abstract legal subjects, putatively equal before the law. Reminding us that we are embodied, reminding us of the affective dimensions of politics. They present a much more fragmented political imaginary. There's no the people or the world proletariat or a unified third world. There's a kind of atomization that is often reflected back in these acts of protest. At work also is a transformation from a politics of representation to a politics of immediacy, of expression of frustration, of anger, of despair, of direct intervention. So there's no patience for intermediaries, no patience for authorizing representatives to act on their behalf. They want to author directly. So our bodies are shaped within a dominant regime of corporeality, but they're not subsumed by it. And when especially these lines of friction reveal themselves, against the ideologies of submission to which we're inculcated, into which we're interpolated, there is this radical untamability of the body that I want to underscore. The universal capacity to express and resist suffering, even when one is not allowed to do so, or even when the conditions are not prone for doing so. So these actions arise from that capacity, and they present us with a kind of corporeal critique, perhaps an insurrectionary one. So I want to conceptualize these as riding the body back into the social, in a sense. And when it does so, and this is my last point, that when the body does write itself back into the social, it doesn't necessarily do it in forms that are conventional, that are vitalist. It can very well choose to harm or end that life. And this is the kind of a protest of a life that sometimes becomes newsworthy only when it ends itself. So this leads to a very sort of despairing picture of the present, but perhaps we can also see in these acts a hearkening, an injunction of a different kind of life, of a just life, and of course, an expression of the impossibility of attaining that life under the conditions that are given, under the conditions that these agents find themselves. So this alternative vision of life, this alternative conception of a just life is, I think, what demands our understanding, and most of all, demands our solidarity. So I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Banu. That was really wonderful. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Ghassan now.
Thank you. Very nice to be here. I have just start by saying that, I'm not a scholar of social movements or a scholar of uprisings, but I actually happen to be also in Lebanon exactly this time last year when the Lebanese Uprising began. And I'm going to try and think a bit with my experience of being on the ground and the issues it raised and how it connects with some of the general issues that are raised in this seminar. The first thing sort of like that attracted my attention has been the need for basic sociology of the uprising. I know we like to do some sort of like innovative things, some new things, it's new uprising, new approaches, new etc. But I think there's also a need for some basic academic work on social composition of people in the streets. Because there were billions of people or 1 million people in the street in Beirut, but they needed to be disentangled analytically, sort of like, in basic terms, in class, gender, etc., but also in terms of distribution of cultural capital, educational capital, distribution, the unequal distribution of activist capital, know-how, how to move in the streets, unequal distribution of capacity to activate social media. But also, I became very interested in the unequal distribution, but unequal, not just distribution, unequal capacity to abuse in a sophisticated manner. There were people who were engaging in political abuse, quite vile in some ways, but presented in a very sophisticated manner, while others were abusing in a gross manner. So the deployment of anger, how the various ways in which anger was deployed in the streets, all of these sort of like create the ground of a need for a kind of sociology of the uprising. And sort of like on the ground in Beirut, I still quite kind of like picture that very clearly, sort of like the people occupied Beirut in a kind of L-shaped way. At the top of the L were people who were facing the parliament and were looking for confrontation and wanted to engage the police, and they were kind of like face-to-face with the police, and they were engaging in very interesting tactics, playing with gender questions and etc. And a bit further down the L, there were more people who were engaging in creative sloganeering and graffitiism and what have you. And on the corner of the L, you had academics doing sit-ins and engaging in teachings and discussion groups and what have you. And then the bottom of the L on the other side, sort of like facing the mosque, there was the biggest part, huge section of the population, which was political, obviously, because it came down, but there was a kind of more carnival feeling with people, families, with kids, etc., ice cream, popcorn, what have you. Now, it is very hard then to say what all these people have in common, except in the sense of like dissatisfaction with the regime. But I think the way I've been thinking it more and more, it's been taken this concept of the desire for the social as something which is very important for me. I mean, it's a bit different from kind of like Foucault's notion, il faut défendre la société, we must defend society, because like in a way, every nation is a society, but more the desire for the social is more kind of like to what extent a society is social is not given, to what extent a society gives you your social worth, to what extent. So it wasn't just, it was simply about symbolic viability, not just material viability. It was about symbolic viability. It was about cultural viability. So there's the concept of viability, social viability became very important for me in thinking through this matter. And it is here that I felt that the uprising really was not a social movement, that it was a social space. And when people sort of like ask for what are your demands, why aren't you formulating demands, I felt I could see the view of the people who felt it was reductive to think of it as a movement that has demands, because it made it more homogeneous. How can a whole society, if you like, as I was on the street, an alternative society, it cannot be reduced to a demand. Sometimes it had continuity with the old society, sometimes it had new things, etc. So I felt increasingly that we were facing not so much an epistemological question of formulating how you think yourself, etc., but rather a certain sense of this is who we are. We don't need to represent ourselves like Banu was saying, but more collectively here. There was not a sense of wanting someone to represent who we are. We are what we are on the street. And so it was more a sense of an ontological politics. The movement is itself on the street, kind of like alter society coming into being, maybe timidly, maybe we're witnessing it in its very, very early stages, but there is definitely a sense of a new society. And I don't mean by new society necessarily a radically new society, but it definitely a new society, and more importantly, a society which wants to be social. And this idea of wanting to be social made me think about what is it that makes existing states today uncommitted to the social. And it links up a bit with the work I've been doing in conjunction with many others on the way neoliberalism, neoliberal capitalist economics is in a way reverting to what Marx calls primitive accumulation. That is, capitalist societies that need to create wild, if you like, environments of profitability in order to ensure the profitability of capital. And in a way, Lebanese capitalism is the avant-garde in this sense, not so much needing to copy Western capitalists. I think Western capitalists have been sort of like sometimes historically you can see all the tendencies of vicious anti-social capitalism happening in Lebanon well before it happens elsewhere. And this is where I started thinking about something that, like I worked with primitive accumulation while I was writing Is Racism an Environmental Threat, my previous book, but I didn't think about this thing specifically, which came to my mind, which is that primitive accumulation, capitalists who make a profit out of plunder, etc., well, they have no interest in reproducing the source of their profitability. Profit is an encounter, it's an act of plunder, and you do it, but you don't think about reproduction of the ground. So you don't reproduce the wilderness, if you like, which I'm not sure that's the right term, but I hope it conveys something about what I'm trying to say here. And in a way, it made sense to me when, not just globally, to think of a capitalist class that is only interested in grabbing whatever profit it can make and not think about the repercussions, especially in relation to the ecological crisis it is producing. It grabs but does not think about sustainability, etc. So this is, but in Lebanon also it seems to have marked really the big difference between the post-Civil War elite ruling class and the pre-Civil War. Both were corrupt, both engaged in maximal profitability, but I think the post-war profitability making is characterized by this kind of like sense of these people were militia during the war. They were in the middle of the war, like they find a shop, they break into the bank, etc., and they grab whatever they can. They don't think about reproduction. So it's a kind of like profit as grab whatever you can because before everything collapses. And in a way, this is how we get a governmental situation which is no longer committed to the social. And so in a way, then I think this is what manifested itself in the early stages of the uprising. Then there's something else that happened at the second stage of the uprising, which is when Hezbollah's leader decided that this uprising was dangerous for its politics in resisting Israel and in its alliance with Iran. And even though in the early stages of the uprising, the population that was in the regions controlled by Hezbollah had joined in massively into the uprising. Suddenly, all these people came out, and this is quite interesting because it was a geopolitical question. I talk about it in terms of the tyranny of the geopolitical, and I think we need to think social movements in their articulation to geopolitical questions. Obviously, this articulation is not the same. The geopolitical does not weigh on and diffuse itself in the local situation in the same way in a variety of places. But I thought also it's very important, though, to think that what happened on the ground was itself an experience where people were thinking new things on the ground. And I'll just quickly give a couple of examples here, sort of like some people were saying, we are speaking in the name of the 6 million Lebanese people who are represented in this square. And someone says, excuse me, no, there's 4 million Lebanese. And someone says, no, actually, we're not speaking only with people who have Lebanese ideas. We're speaking in the name of the Syrian refugees and the Palestinian refugees. And I could see in that encounter, the man who was surprised that the woman was saying 6 million was confronted with the idea of a politics which represents everyone who exists in Lebanon, regardless of their formal nationality, for the first time. Now, whether he is convinced or not, I'm not sure, but what is interesting is how the ground of the uprising became itself a creator of new political horizons. And so that's why there's a need for an ethnography of the uprising to fully understand. There was also a question of people will say, look, there's so many Sunnis here. It's obvious you say you're national, but in fact, these are Sunnis who are against Hezbollah. And so they are Sunni using secular words and secular concepts to argue sectarian positions. But then it became interesting because is it the same or is it better? There's no facile answer, but is it better to have secular demands and express them in a sectarian manner, as Lebanese politics often did? Or is it better to have sectarian demands and expressing them in secular manner? So is the movement reconceptualizing the language of politics, and therefore is that a good thing, as opposed to keeping the language of politics sectarian, etc. I think I need to finish. Okay.
Thank you, Ghassan. That was great. I'm going to turn it over to Alberto now for our final presentation.
Yeah, well, thank you, Nasser, and thank you to all the organizers and the speakers for the opportunity to join this conversation. What I really wanted to do in these remarks is to think a little more about one of the questions in the very helpful invitation, so to speak, which is really the question of the naming of this moment, perhaps this decade, as an age or a time of riots. And I suppose one of the ways perhaps to approach this is to ask whether riots, whether indeed riots in their temporality, in their temporal experience, can make an age or should make an age, whether riots can indeed be periodized, and whether that periodization is indeed something that is an imperative for political thought and political experience. Now, some of this is in dialogue, of course, with a vast literature, but really more specifically with two authors, one of them being the French anthropologist Alain Bertho, who published two books over this period. The first in 2009, Les Temps des Émeutes, and a follow-up to that volume, which I think was translated into English as The Age of Violence, but which in French is called Les Enfants du Chaos, Les Temps des Martyrs. And the other author is Joshua Clover in his book, Riot, Strike, Riot. Now, one of the reasons why I think the parallax of these two books is quite fascinating is because they have, in many ways, a convergent object, even a convergent, at least in part, phenomenology of that which might be common to contemporary phenomena of insurgency. But they have diametrically opposed relationships to the question of history or historicity and revolution. Basically, Bertho's work is focused on the way in which the experience, or what he calls the anthropology of the present, that is manifest in phenomena of uprising across completely, in a way, dissimilar localities, manifest a closure of the identity between, in a sense, political modernity, or at least the articulation between political modernity and revolution, which in some sense for him begins, in 1848, and then with, of course, large caesuras, not least the Russian Revolution, goes all the way past 68 into the relatively recent present. Now, contrary-wise, Clover's book is in many ways precisely about how to extract, develop, reinvent a theory of revolution in the absence of its traditional Marxist reference, class understood in a strictly industrial point of production way, party, or indeed socialist states for that matter. So on that basis, I think there's two lines of inquiry that one can take. One is about the commonality, so the idea, which in many ways is present also in the title of this series of talks, that there is a commonality to the present sequence or multitude of insurgencies. And the other question is really the question about thinking epically. And I kind of want to deal more with the second one. Though I think it is worth asking when we name phenomena as spatially separate and as dissimilar in their origins and histories as the uprisings in recent uprisings in Hong Kong or Chile, or indeed following Ghassan's talk, Lebanon, or indeed the United States. What is the nature of that commonality? Is it a commonality of tactics? Is it a commonality of negations, the refusal of representation very broadly and very widely understood? Is it a commonality that has to do with the ways in which these tactics and these experiences communicate with one another, are, socially, albeit at a distance, mediated in some sense? And I think in some sense approaching the issue through the prism of the history and temporality of riots might allow us to problematize at least a kind of prima facie claim about commonality. And I suppose one of the ironies of contemporary epical thinking, or even of naming the current moment as an age of riots, is that in some sense, and this I think is true at least of its formulation in Clover's book, that in some sense it retains much, or perhaps almost all, of the form of a traditional conceptualization of revolution in a Marxian vein, while emptying it or evacuating it of a certain content. So in some sense, we still have the idea that there is a leading figure of struggle. We still have the idea that some struggles have a greater capacity, a greater leverage on the system than others. We still have a kind of directionality of antagonism and systemic challenge, but all of the historically specific reference that were attached to that form of periodizing argument are removed. Now, I think one of the ironies then becomes, to my mind, that ultimately periodizing thought, not just in Marxism, but I think in most emancipatory or many emancipatory or radical movements, was ultimately hinged to the notion of strategy. You name the time as a particular time because it allows you to anticipate and act upon it in a certain way and identify who, where, and how transformation might eventuate. The curious thing, of course, about the synthesis of this strategic periodizing form with the experience, and indeed with the imminent or internal temporality of rioting itself is that in many ways the riot is a quintessentially anti-strategic form. And I don't mean that as in any sense as a disparaging point, but in some way there's a presence and an immediacy, and in that sense also you could argue a lack of demands or mediation about uprisings or riots that rejects that strategic horizon. Now, in the case of Alain Bertho's work, that is in a sense affirmed, albeit in a somewhat melancholy, pessimistic kind of way. Whilst I think in some sense in Clover's work, there's a sense that the riot has this historicizing subjectivity of its own, and therefore can in many ways give birth to a strategy and a movement out of its own tactics or out of its own experience and practice. And here I think it's interesting to also just think of the limits, you know, what might be the limits or what might be the blind spots perhaps of that strategic temporalizing and periodizing horizon that our desire to name our age involves. And there's a nice formulation in a text from 1984 by Cedric Robinson, a text called An Inventory of Contemporary Black Politics, that was published in a briefly lived but fascinating journal that Paul Gilroy and Vron Ware, amongst others, were putting together, called Emergency. This is a kind of journal published where Cedric Robinson was published alongside Kathy Acker, which is, you know, an interesting conjunction, if nothing else. And in that essay, you know, prolonging a certain Black radical polemic against at least, you know, most traditional varieties of Marxism or Marxism tout court, Robinson writes the following. He says, in the tradition which has dominated radical analyses, the logic of political movements has been thought to be discoverable through retracing the processes of victimization to the apparatus of oppression. The ultimate measure of social resistance is presumed to be the character and the historical development of the offending structure itself. This is a theory of history which argued that the agents of change were most genuinely identified in residual terms. Now, I think part of the challenge to this question is, at least if we view it through the arguments that link the age of riots to the increasing centrality of surplus populations, the increasing centrality of the sphere of circulation of our production, the formations of debt, financialization, and so on, there is a sense in which at least a certain variant of this periodizing thinking tells us, well, riot is the form or is the subject of antagonism at present because that is where the transformations of capital have pushed it. Now, I think in some sense that then rubs up against the experience of time or the temporality of riots themselves. And I think it's in a sense this disjunction or this hiatus, which I think is so important to think through. And here I'm thinking of the brilliant work which I had the fortune to translate by the Italian methodologist Furio Iesi, who wrote a book about the Spartacist rebellion of 1919 and its mediations in literature, theater, poetics, and so on. And for Iesi, what one sees in Spartacus is this disjunction, which is in many ways a classic disjunction between revolt and revolution, but it's a temporal disjunction. Where revolt or riot or uprising is temporally defined by its suspension of historical time, by its refusal of directionality, by what in a nice formulation he says it's a taking shelter from historical time and building the symbolism of a collective there. So I think that tension, again, between the idea of a global age of riots defined by certain subjectivities, tactics, and political forms, and on the other hand, the suspension of historicity in riots themselves is something that's definitely worth thinking through in advancing this collective discussion. And lastly, just to finish, I think it's also significant to perhaps suspend or reflect on a periodizing reflex that intellectuals or theorists often have when met with phenomena of insurgency, by thinking about the way in which these phenomena really exist, not in an easily circumscribed conjuncture or easily circumscribed period of capital, or indeed even of political representational history, but have really long durations. And I think the naming, for instance, by various figures, including Robin Kelly, of the recent rebellions, the George Floyd rebellions of the Black Lives Matter movement, in terms of the third reconstruction, is particularly telling, in the sense of seeing phenomena that might appear in this flash of presence as actually responding to histories and to experiences and to traditions of struggle that are very difficult to, or which would be, it would be very unjust or limiting to circumscribe within this decade, or indeed even to identify by their parallels or commonalities with what is happening in synchronicity or contemporaneity elsewhere. So I'll stop here then. Thanks.
Thank you, Alberto, and thank you all three of you for the very rich set of ideas. At this stage, I want to invite Lisa to try to piece together a few comments and maybe involve our participants in that. And I think we'll do that for about half an hour. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Lisa.
Okay, thank you so much. What a wide range of presentations over the range of questions that were asked in the prompt. But I think if there's one key word across the three presentations, it's the term unevenness, that all of our presenters were talking about problems and questions and problematics of unevenness, and the question of commonality and what that might mean. So in the first instance, we have Ghassan talking about the uprising in Lebanon and calling for a sociology and ethnography, because insofar as this is a spectacle that doesn't really constitute a movement, then the question is, how do we investigate the conditions, the provocations, and the modes of address that these uprisings were addressed to? From Alberto, we have questions about temporality, but especially about how modes of uprising do or do not align with an analytic of historical materialism and historical conditions. How do we think about the unevenness of forms of uprising in relation to a less fixed analytic paradigm of the modes of capital accumulation or the forms of colonial expropriation in the present moment? The third, Banu is raising questions about the unevenness of the impact of violence on the body, and a very evocative discussion of the way that bodily protests and bodily politics address the very unequal ways that violence affects different bodies, and that this form of bodily protest is actually a central factor and a central aspect of forms of uprising in the present. So I have a question to address to all panelists, to ask you to think about and to relate your comments to the question of scale and scalability and geographical location. And you know, the name of the title, the keyword for this panel is the word global. The uprisings are global. Well, in what sense are these current uprisings global? And what is, you know, the question of unevenness that you all raised throw into question the notion of what's global about them. But what about a regional perspective? One of the questions raised in the prompts that I would love to hear people address is what is a global perspective from a regional standpoint? For instance, how does global uprising look from the perspective of the Middle East, right? What does it look like from Palestine, Beirut, and Cairo, as opposed to how does global uprising, or the question of global uprising, look from Latin America, from Bolivia and Chile at the moment? How does it look from the standpoint of Europe, from revolts against the EU, from Grexit to Brexit, right? And how does it look from the standpoint of Asia right now, and the uprisings in Thailand drawing from those in Hong Kong? That these are very different regional locations for thinking about the conditions and projects. There's a book by Paul Amar called Security Archipelago that some of you may know, which I think is resonant on this question, and that he says that he's arguing that looked at from the standpoint of the global north, the transitional moment of uprising is addressing the crisis of neoliberal capitalism. But from the standpoint of the legacy of post-colonial nationalism in the global south, there's the rise of a security state, and that the direction of change is possibly seen coming from the global south to the north rather than the north to the south, in the spread of notions of securitization rather than primarily in the crisis of neoliberalism. But so what I was also from Banu's presentation, perhaps it's not the geography only, that's the question of perspective and scale, but also locations like the prison or the street, right? How do these particular forms of location, what does global uprising look like from the standpoint of the prison, right? That's a huge question, but I'm just wondering, in problematizing the notion of the global and thinking about unevenness, as all of you did, how does it matter the way the physical location and perspective and the scalability from that perspective of the ways that you are all thinking about uprising? If anybody wants to try that.
I think we should do it by alphabetical order before.
Thanks for throwing me under the bus. Lisa, thank you so much. I think those are wonderful questions, and you really pointed out a problematic of unevenness that wasn't really visible to me as I was, preparing my notes and hearing other speakers. So that was very eye-opening. Thank you so much. In what sense are they global, you ask? And the first thing that comes to my mind is that the global from the perspective of protest is a work in progress. That first and foremost, what these different acts of protest are doing, whether they are riots or the kinds of acts that I'm looking at, hunger strikes or self-immolations, they are, I think, arguing against a conception of the global that is a dominant form of, or hegemonic form of globality, the globality that is imposed by global capitalism. I mean, that is both the precondition of these protests to be understanding themselves as global, but also something against which they're working, I think, to produce an alternative conception of the global. And maybe one important difference that they are presenting us with in this alternative or maybe subaltern conception of the global is that they are very, very space or location specific in their origination. I mean, it is not a global call for revolution that we're witnessing. There are many, many different struggles happening, and they develop in response to their kind of specific and local conditions, though, of course, when we take a bird's eye view, we see that those conditions are replicated in different forms in many places. But their point of origin seems more contingent, more contextually bound. And yet, I think what they do, at least one of the things that they do, is to call into being a kind of global audience that is receptive, that is interested in a kind of politics of solidarity that transcends those localities. And I think maybe this is, I won't say completely unprecedented and new. Maybe it started with the French Revolution. I don't know. I don't want to periodize after hearing Alberto. I'm hesitant to do that. But I think this kind of calling into being this new form of audience that is related to one another through very new forms of social media as well, that's connected in different ways, connected by mobilities. I think that's really new. And so I think the new form of globality in action is maybe to be found in this tension between the local point of origination of these protests and the kind of reach and reverberations that they aspire to have, let's say, in terms of the audiences that they bring into being.
Yes, thanks. That's great, actually. I think one of the issues is that the global itself is unevenly distributed. So bringing unevenness and the global together is quite important in some ways. And there's, for instance, to what extent the global is experienced. You know, I can be, like most academics, we tend to exist locally and globally at the same time. So some people are more globally located than others in Lebanon or in the US or elsewhere. I think one of the issues that I find very interesting is the question of inheritance of uprising traditions. So like how people inherit traditions. Some traditions are national and some traditions are international. And who can, so inherit, I like the concept of inheritance. First of all, it's very anthropological, but also it has to do with the question of that you are not determined by your inheritance. Your inheritance is something you negotiate. You can refuse your inheritance, you can select from your inheritance. You inherit. One thing you can't do is act as if you have not inherited, because even if you act as if you have not inherited, it's part of negotiating your inheritance. And so there are various traditions of that social movements inherit, and various ways of acting and thinking, and they select from them. Now, very interestingly, in the case of Lebanon, it's also mediated diasporically, the question of the globe. You know, when people were on the ground in Beirut discussing social issues, there were many times that I found myself sitting among people who did not share Lebanese language, because there were people who had come from Brazil and people who had come from the US and people who had come from a variety of points. And in fact, the only way they could discuss things were in English. And so we were sitting in Beirut and all these Lebanese from a variety of places were talking in English because that was the only language they had in common. So I think I like very much that question of raising the question of the global like this, but I think also we need to think it in its plurality rather than as some kind of like opposition between the local and the global.
I really like the point about inheritance that Ghassan just made, and made me think of a peculiar moment when I was teaching a few years ago. I think it was a course about social movements in London. And this was, I think, 2015. And it became rapidly evident in a seminar discussion that my students had far greater information and understanding of what had happened in Ferguson a year before than what had happened in London 4 years before. massive insurgency, riots that interrupted the circulation and reproduction of large swathes of the city in the neighborhoods, I imagine, where they live, because it was all over the city, but which seemed to 3-4 years later a very distant concern. The intensity of their identification, let's say, not to put a Freudian or Lacanian spin on it, but just in a very vulgar sense, with that experience was quite remarkable. So in some sense, Ferguson was closer to London than London in a very odd way. So it made me think that these experiences of locality are peculiar, and it's also an issue about maybe also about what circulates, right? So I was looking, I think yesterday, at footage of some protests against police violence in Chicago, where the Hong Kong tactic of the umbrellas was very visibly present against tear gas and so on and so forth. Some symbols circulate, but then are appropriated in very different ways. So in Italy, all of a sudden, figures that were linked to Italy's often totally foreclosed colonial past were the objects of vandalism, which was a total discovery, as though nobody had remembered. Videos were brought up of Italian TV shows where famous Italian journalists in the 60s had been attacked for their racism that nobody remembers seeing, and so on and so forth. So there's a very peculiar logic, which is very different, at least in my experience, to a logic that was much more clearly scalar in the so-called sequence of anti-globalization movements, which in one sense were very, very, they were global in their representations, in their theories, and so on. But in terms of the organizing, there was a way in which, you had, the Italians from the various regions getting together with their Italian group and then going to the summit in Germany where they would meet the German comrades. And, in some sense, there was a regional organizing that was much more kind of traditional. Whilst I think in this moment, the short circuits, so to speak, or which are sometimes very deceiving, but nevertheless take place, make the idea of scale, of a kind of nested scales, no longer really work, or even less so than it might have before. So I just kind of find that a striking phenomenon in some sense.
Well, Nasser, I have one more question, but I also want to leave time for Q&A so I would be happy to pass on that and allow time for Q&A, or
it's up
go
to
for
you.
one more question.
It's up to you. If you want to pose it, and maybe we can then move to Q&A. Okay. If people have questions that maybe they don't have to answer it now.
Okay, I'll pose the one more question, and then we can address it however in the Q&A or from the panelists. And that really has to do with the question of the state. I was really struck when I read, Alberto, your review of the Joshua Clover book. There was a phrase you had about both the refusal of and the desire for the state, drawing from some, I can't remember what the citation was now, but I was struck with how much of the debate on the left really circles around what the state is imagined to be, what a state politics is imagined to be, what an evasion of the state, what the stakes are in an evasion of the state. It's like this is a moment when whatever we imagine the state to be, it's imagined both as a necessity for transformation and also as the inevitable betrayer of the imagination of transformation. And so in thinking about uprisings, from these different, I really loved what Ghassan said about the global itself being uneven, right? And so is the conception of what the state is. I like Timothy Mitchell's definition of the really completely decentered notions of what the state is. But the imaginary of the state is certainly either to evade it or to address it, or in some way to relate with it, is a central problematic for uprising in different ways in different parts of the world, in different ways in different demographic settings and so forth. So I was just wondering, and it is a huge question and an unanswerable one in a way, but I was wondering if you all wanted to say anything about the imagined address to either the state or an evasion of the state.
Thank you, Lisa. That was, I mean, I don't know if anyone wants to respond to that now. My suggestion would be to maybe see if there are other questions, then we can respond to a cluster. So I'd like to invite everyone with us to pitch in. Again, you can use the raise hand function. I see that there's one question in the chat. I mean, it's an incredibly rich set of ideas. I have a ton of questions, but I'll bracket them for now. Or maybe I won't. It's gonna jump. So maybe while people gather their thoughts, I'll just tack on a question that has kind of just been inspired by listening to you all now, and I think it relates to this question of periodization and the state, which is really I think it's a question about fatalism and transition, maybe. So if we bracket, and I hear the kind of warning bells about not assuming too much of a commonality of uprising. And one of the things we're going to explore later is reaction and insurrection. What happens when the right is insurrectionary? But bracketing that for a moment, one of the impulses that we were sort of responding to in this series was the kind of sense, especially looking back at the last 10 years, and especially I'd say in the context of the Arab revolts in the Middle East, a kind of resigned fatalism about the trajectory of these moments and events, right? That insurrection has been reduced to a necessary kind of fatal cycle of reenactment, right? That it is always going to be revolt without revolution at some level, right? And that it has this kind of circular logic, right? In part because the state as this very contradictory object of desire never gets captured, right? The infrastructures never get entirely disrupted. The armed forces are very rarely split. And so you're stuck in a kind of cycle of reenactment in which the best one can hope for is a kind of effect on policy, say, right? And there are coinages like revolution to think about what happened in the Middle East, right? It's a kind of reform, revolution hybrid, and this is the sort of the best we can get. It seems to me that part of what we're grappling with here is, in a way, a kind of flight from that, right? It's especially as I see it in these sort of imminent constitutive moments of uprising as we understand them, the body, the social, these new subject objects of uprising, subjects objects of politics. But the kind of flip side of that, if you will, is where that leaves sort of imaginaries or ideas of large-scale transition of, does this become a sort of flight away from the kind of impasse of transition that we face? Again, not just thinking of sort of uprising on the left, if you will. And maybe that's why periodization becomes such a thorny issue, because of course it was transition in a certain sense, right? Understood revolution as the motor of historical change that changed the period. And now we're kind of grappling with periodic changes that don't, at least in form, don't relate to that. So I don't know, what does one do with that resignation? How does one think it? And is there a way of thinking past the impulse to flight here? You don't have to answer that straight away. I'd just like to see if there's, again, any questions from the floor.
Maybe thinking of the point that Lisa raised about the state and your remarks now, I mean, I wonder if this also demands having a somewhat less monolithic or Manichaean relationship to this now extremely naturalized distinction between non-representational politics and representational politics. So uprisings, rebellions may not involve delegations or representatives or electoral or reformist desires. They are, of course, profoundly symbolic and in many ways representational acts in their own right, sometimes more or less consciously. Much in the same way that you know, armed struggle through much of the 20th century was a very representational activity in many ways. Many armed struggle groups never thought they were going to gain state power through their actions. So there's I think there's at times a kind of fallacious idea that the insurgency or the street or the clash is this moment of immediacy, and then there's this other dimension of representation. And I think in some sense, maybe one has to really parse the distinction between, first of all, the representational and the state or the parliamentary, and then even within the state. I mean, we see it now in the United States, which are not so united, that, you know, municipal, state, federal authorities are often very disarticulated in their jurisdictions, in their internal relationships by insurgencies. Or you see, for instance, the situation in a few days in Chile. There will be a constitutional referendum, which was forced by an astounding, insurgency of popular struggles at all sorts of levels. And, and I guess that remains open. You know, is this, the capture into a kind of electoral state building, revolutionary temporality, or is there a way of maintaining this, more virtuous dialectic between what's happening in terms of insurgent movements and what's happening at the political sphere? And there, it's very interesting that there are two elements to the referendum. One is, do you want a new constitution? The second one is, who gets to write the new constitution? And that's, in a sense, the big issue. Is this written by previously elected members of parliament, or is it an actual constituent assembly that has no vertical kind of presence in that sense? And that's, I think, some of the problems that very specific problems that we encounter, right?
Can I get in here? But I've just been thinking about the question of periodization. On one hand, I mean, it's a bit straitjacketing to raise the issue of periodization, not just to accept, like, let's say, a Marxist periodization, etc. And to reflect to what extent periodization is an academic question. So is it just a perspective? An academic is observing the process and is trying to periodize by having a transcendent position which situates the present in relation to the past, etc. But I think there is that, and so it's a critique of academic thought, and the tendency of academic thought to want to periodize and put things in a neat temporal perspective. But there is, of course, also temporalities that are produced in practice. So to what extent the uprising itself periodizes itself, so to speak. To what extent, again, to bring out the question of inheritance, to what extent and how it situates itself temporally in relation to what it is inheriting globally, regionally, and locally. So like, do you see the Lebanese uprising as late compared to the rest of the Arab uprisings? Or do you see it as also something new and unique because the previous Lebanese uprisings were of a completely different order? So we are dealing with many, there's also the perspective of the temporality of capital. And I think dealing with what I'm calling primitive accumulation, and and the idea where, I think, to me at least, I want to convey more and more the importance of this point for me. There is a section of capital which sees profit as an encounter, not as a structure. So it's the idea of, okay, where can we make some profit for it? I think this negates the sense of temporality. Sometimes capital had a temporality when it was more structured, if you like. And therefore, when a practice situates itself in time and think about its past and thinks about its future, when a practice of profit making think of itself only in terms of an encounter and a moment, does it rid the social of its temporality and its capacity to provide its own periodization? And then it becomes simply the academics like us sitting down, imagining periods that nobody else is experiencing.
I want to comment on that, to say that I think the question of periodization is in part, well, it's an obsession of historians, an academic question, but it's also very much a activist question of the focus of mobilizations. I mean, there's the temporalities of capitalism and the temporalities of accumulation, but there are also the temporalities of racial nationalism and of settler colonialism and white supremacy that are, of course, very much entwined with the temporality of capitalism, but not really the same. Also the temporality of ecological disaster. So obviously that also is intertwined with the temporality of capitalism and of settler colonialism, but it also has another, I mean, in indigenous epistemologies, the ecological disaster has another temporality. And so with the family and modes of social reproduction and the organization of gender and generation, that also intertwined with capitalism, intertwined with white supremacy, but it also has its own temporal reference points, its own historicizations. And when people are mobilizing, they are mobilizing with vocabularies and reference points that are tied to these overlapping, but sometimes incommensurate temporalities, so that it isn't only a question of academic periodization, but a question of the temporal imaginary, right? The temporal reference points for different sites of this kind of uneven, the unevenness of uprising.
If I may jump in, I think the question of temporality for me is also linked very closely to a broader question about our relationship to history, our relationship to a philosophy of history. And in particular, in the present, since most of us no longer have a belief that history will tend toward greater equality or progress or greater justice, I think it strains our relationship with temporality, with our present, in a way that it takes away sort of the relief of having some ultimate guarantee that things will succeed, that things will turn to the better. And then we are left with a kind of either a very sort of haphazard understanding in which every event is sort of has to be given meaning in and of itself, or a more cyclical kind of reading where you know, there is oppression and then there's pushback, but then there is, so it's kind of like action reaction. Or maybe if you're a pessimist, you have a more sort of a narrative of decline. But in any case, when there's no longer that guarantee of a progressive philosophy of history, I think that really puts social movements or these individual acts of resistance in a difficult place, in having to invent a new kind of relationship to the present and to the future. I think that there's that big difference in the philosophical baggage, let's say, of contemporary struggles that is a different that I want to put on the table.
Yeah, that's really to Nasser's point too about fatalism. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah.
We have one question maybe that we can bring in from the chat, which is from Alan Feldman about terminology and about concepts. And they ask why, I'll just read it out. Why is the criminalizing mass media and legally loaded term riot being used uncritically to describe crowd actions or street level rebellions and occupations? I guess this is more of a question for Joshua Clover, who's not with us, but maybe mediated. But they also make the point that activists have insisted on the police as the subject of riot recently, rather than themselves as the subjects of riot, and that there is a broader history to the term riot, and I guess that takes us back to a conceptual, maybe semantic kind of place. I don't know if anyone wants to think about that.
I mean, I think since we're talking about naming moments and naming actions, the point is very well taken. I mean, as you noted, that it was brought up in a sort of quotation, so to speak, of Joshua's work. The extent to which I guess terms like riot can be appropriated and affirmed notwithstanding or in the face of or in some kind of détournement of their obviously criminal and juridical history. I mean, people still read the Riot Act at demonstrations in the United Kingdom, so it's not history. I guess is open. I mean, another thing to think about. I mean, you were, I believe, were indicating it as well. Is we also have a tendency, of course, to immediately think that terms like rebellion and revolt, or indeed a certain variety of riot, are coded in an emancipatory key, which is a very bad, optimistic leftist habit that we should probably abandon, especially in these very dark times. I mean, if I remember reading a wonderful book, Peter Fryer's history of Black people in Britain. And of course, all the entries for riots are riots against Black people. They're the Notting Hill riots. They're the until the 1980s, when you have the uprisings and rebellions in Brixton and Toxteth and so on. Riot is a form of popular racist violence against migrants and racialized people. You could go all the way back to the East St. Louis riots that Du Bois writes about in 1917. So I think we also need to think, and that's, I guess, one of the virtues of the Alain Bertho book, is that he's actually quite open about how these forms also bring in all sorts of identitarian, communal violence, etc., and can't just be thought of as proto or post-revolutionary if we think of revolutionary as an emancipatory concept. So I think that's probably a worthwhile reminder. If we are in an age of uprisings or riots, they're not necessarily all riots or uprisings that we would want to sign up to in some sense or another.
Yeah.
If no one else wants to add to that, there's a question from Megan Morris. And Megan, if you want to unmute yourself and pose it.
Thank you, and thank you all for a really wonderful session. I'm in Sydney, and my involvement is overwhelmingly with Hong Kong. And I have a comment and a question mainly for Ghassan. I'll try to be very brief, but first I'd like to say that this idea of the unevenness of the global is most vividly captured for me by the way on social media, different places created versions of the Hong Kong community authored anthem, Glory Be to Hong Kong, in their own languages, and it went all through various platforms. I saw it being sung in Catalan in Spain, and the first verse would always repeat the Hong Kong words, but then go into their local situations, which were very, very different. This was an anthem written out of the community and performed in shopping malls by thousands of people until the recent laws have made that impossible. One of the things that is distinctive, I think, in Hong Kong, Ashish Rajadhyaksha has pointed this out in an issue of Inter-Asia Cultural Studies on the umbrella movement, that the umbrella movement began and then more recently extended a movement for no change, that Hong Kong people, by hanging on to the idea of one country, two systems, as they watched it become one country, 1.5 system, one country, 1.25, and now just one system. I mean, that is over well in advance of 2047. That it's very unusual to have an uprising that is demanding that nothing change. And one of the versions of no change, I think, referring to Ghassan's talk, was exactly the Hong Kong social, that Hong Kong social life practices are not at all saturated in representation or democratic values, but in particular modes of care, and I think bodily care, which you could see in the most violent protests where communities organised their own medical groups. And I don't think that contradicts the examples that Banu Bargu was giving us, but it's on a continuum where, against extreme militarized police violence, against children, against old people, you had little militias going around taking care of people. And of course, we reach the point where those people are arrested and brutalized. So what is a revolution for no change, given the largely Western paradigms of thought that we've been tossing around? And Ghassan, was there contestation about the social being produced in the Lebanese situation? Because I would see Hong Kong as a fight over what social life should be like. And I'm just interested to hear what you think of that. No change versus revolutionary models and contested social.
Yeah. I'll start, but I'm sure the others will have something interesting to say. Well, I mean, what you just said reminded me of something very very crucial in researching diaspora. That is that you can actually migrate by moving somewhere else, and you can migrate by staying where you are, and the world underneath you changes. So what you end up always in a situation of someone in a different environment, or a different person in the same environment, etc. And I think what you said reminds me of the importance of the question of viability that I'm trying to highlight. The social as being the source of symbolic, moral, and economic viability, and a rejection of concept of viability, which is simply based on economic viability, and but not even guaranteeing that. But I think it seemed to me that there was a commitment. Why the commitment to the two systems of Hong Kong is a commitment to the idea that the worthiness of our lives in the two systems was more guaranteed. So the one system was not against just systems. It was the fear of being in what one imagines to be imagined for good reasons, because they have practical experience of it, to become encompassed in a space which dilutes one's moral and symbolic and even economic viability. And I think this quest, because when you look at, actually sort of like when you look at many of the uprisings, and sort of like Alberto sort of like noted that in one of his comments, has to do as a lot of the language does not want to stick to economistic language, and in many ways, I'm haunted now after Banu's talk by the sewing of the lips, and the idea of, I don't want to even represent myself when you sew your lips. Just my pure existence is where my viability should be, not by some kind of like symbolic. I think all of these play. I hope I answered sort of like, or reflected on the issue you raised here.
Does anyone else have any comments they'd like to add from our panel? We've reached the end of our formal time.
Can I say something?
Yeah, please, Banu.
Yeah, I wanted to quickly respond to Alain Feldman's very important intervention about the word riot, and taking the opportunity of this virtual format. I was actually Googling the etymology of the word riot. And I saw, and I just wanted to share this, that one of the possible sources of the word is from the Latin rugire, which means to roar. And perhaps one of our tasks as, I mean, I take his point. I think it's really important not to throw the word around carelessly, but maybe one of our tasks as intellectuals is to try to recuperate and to reclaim the word as much as it allows it, and maybe this is part of our discursive struggle. So of course I was not doing this consciously. I don't remember if I used the word or not, but now that I have Alain's voice in my head warning about it, I maybe want to transform it into a possibly a subversive repurposing of the word. And I think maybe this is important on the discursive front to do, to precisely counteract that kind of criminalization.
Well, I think on that very subversive note, we might wrap up our formal proceedings. A good place.
Okay, thank you all.
all.
I have to go. I will not be able to do.
Thank you, Ghassan. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Nice to be with you all. Yes.
Thank you, Ghassan, and thank you all. That was an incredibly rich discussion that I've taken a huge amount from.